Judas Iscariot was part of the group of disciples who accompanied Jesus during his preaching. His figure has remained linked to one of the most significant moments of that story, the handing over of his master to the authorities. According to the accounts, he led the soldiers to him and pointed him out with a kiss, after having agreed to receive an amount of money for doing so. The nickname Iscariot seems to indicate that he came from Kerioth, a locality located in Judea, which differentiated him from the rest of the group, mostly formed by Galileans. He lived in a time of great tension under the control of the Roman Empire. In that context, many people were waiting for the arrival of a leader who would change the political situation. Some followers thought that Jesus would bring that change. Judas shared many experiences with the other disciples, journeys, meetings, and moments of teaching. He was entrusted with the task of managing the group's resources. His story has been remembered for centuries for the role he played in the events leading up to the arrest of Jesus. And what became of Judas after Jesus was taken to the cross? The origin of a promise. In a simple village of Judea called Kerioth, whose name in the local language only meant village, the son of Simon Iscariot and Siberia was born. He was one of several siblings: Zur, Tzvi, Nahum, Tal, Lazar, Asher, and Ezra. The family lived modestly, sustained by the trade of merchant that the father practiced with discipline. Without luxuries but without privations, the home grew with order. As an adult, that son formed his own family alongside Rahamim, a woman considered upright and respected for her character. Together they raised 3 children, Barak, Naim, and Ben Judas. During his childhood he lived in Kerioth, surrounded by games among siblings and neighbors. At the age of 10, due to his father's work, the family moved to Nazareth. In that new environment, the ordinary was altered when an errand led the father to seek furniture for their new home. Recommendations guided him to the workshop of a carpenter named Joseph, originally from Bethlehem. One day the boy accompanied his father to the carpentry shop. While the adults discussed the errand, he watched intently as a young man his age carefully sanded a piece of wood. That youth, noticing the persistent gaze, looked up and asked simply, "What is your name?" The answer was brief. He was from Kerioth. The other smiled. "Judas, like my brother. Are you also from Judea?" Upon confirming that he was, the boy from Nazareth expressed with some joy the possibility that if they stayed in the city, they could become friends. He said it with a look that contained a barely disguised plea. That same morning, a young woman entered the workshop with a child in her arms. It was Mary, the carpenter's wife, and the little one was James. After saying goodbye, the visitor left with his father, but something had changed. From then on, every occasion the father visited the workshop, the boy insisted on accompanying him. On those visits, the encounters with Jesus, the young carpenter, became habitual. They talked about games, about the wooden toys that Jesus himself carved, horses, soldiers, carts. Over time, their conversations deepened. Jesus shared stories of his childhood, such as that time when his family emigrated to Egypt after his birth and returned when Herod died. The family that had just arrived found housing near the workshop, which facilitated the closeness between the 2 young men. Soon the afternoons were filled with games and conversations. The friendship grew naturally, without haste. One afternoon, the mother of Jesus invited him to dinner. He hesitated, worried about what his parents might say, but since they were Judeans like them, he decided to stay. That night he met Jesus' siblings, Joseph, Simon, another Judas, Ruth, Rachel, and James. Jesus was the eldest. During the meal he felt uncomfortable. He spoke little, distracted by the figure of Mary. She sat at the table with her husband and children, something unusual. She radiated a serenity that stood out amidst an undoubtedly demanding life. Joseph, the carpenter, treated her with evident respect. From then on, the visits became more frequent. Over time, both Mary and Joseph began to suspect that perhaps the visitor had an interest in one of their daughters. But it was not so. For him, Ruth and Rachel were like his own sisters. The center of his attention was Jesus, a singular young man. He had an unusual maturity. He spoke of profound ideas with the seriousness of someone much older. He claimed to feel that he had a mission, something he had to fulfill, although he did not yet know exactly what it consisted of. His friend listened to him fascinated. so much so that he asked to be part of that path once he knew it. While one spoke, the other paid attention. Jesus' words were firm, sure, and his eyes sparkled with each reflection. Among his most disconcerting statements was the one about not seeing himself growing old. He felt, he said, that he would die young. His friend tried to dissuade him, talking about distant futures, large families, generations to come. Jesus laughed, but the melancholic shadow in his eyes did not dissipate. One morning, dressed in their best clothes, both were ready to travel to Jerusalem with their families. They would celebrate the Passover in the temple. The journey, on the backs of donkeys, would take them 5 days. Along the way, they entertained themselves talking about the offerings, playing and running after small animals. Finally, upon arriving in Jerusalem, they were greeted by the bustle of a city overflowing with visitors. The activity was constant, the crowd immense. They sought lodging, and afterward the two friends went out to explore. They walked the streets, crossed the main portico of the temple, walked along Herodian Street. Upon reaching the hippodrome, they tried to see the races, but the people prevented any view. They continued until the pool of Siloam. The sunset tinged the stones red and gold, marking the end of the tour. They ran back to the inn, worried about having delayed too much. The next day was Saturday. Alongside their families, they headed to the temple to present the offerings. Joseph and Mary brought 2 turtle doves. The other family, a kid. At that moment, the young man from Kerioth noticed the differences between their economic situations. Jesus did not seem affected by that. During the prayer, while the others prostrated themselves, Jesus remained standing, observing the altar in silence. His father corrected him gently. Later, they returned to the inn without mentioning the matter further. At dawn the next day, Jesus proposed to return once more to the temple. His friend accompanied him. There they met some doctors of the law who were discussing the scriptures. First they listened. Then Jesus began to intervene, his questions surprised with their depth and his opinions with their clarity. He was barely 12 years old, but he spoke with a confidence that astonished. Time passed without them noticing. When they left the temple and returned to the inn, they discovered that their families had departed. The young man from Kerioth was desperate. He imagined the punishment, the anguish of his parents. He reacted with anger and shouted at Jesus, but he responded calmly. He assured that they would soon return to look for them. They returned to the temple. There they spent 2 nights, welcomed by the kindness of some wise men. They offered them food and a place to sleep. On the 3rd day their parents returned, their faces marked by worry. Upon finding them, Jesus took full responsibility. Joseph said nothing. He hugged him and all set out on the way back home. After that trip, something changed. In the midst of games or conversations, Jesus would lose himself in thoughts. Sometimes he would stand still, his gaze fixed on nothing. His friend would shake him to bring him back. One day Jesus looked at him and said seriously that he wanted to teach, but not like the doctors of the law. He wanted to do it his way. The other listened to him in silence. At that moment he did not fully understand. Over the years the pieces would fit together. The bond between the two remained strong. One afternoon the young man went to Jesus' house and was received by Mary with tears in her eyes. She told him that Joseph was very ill. Upon reaching the bed he found the carpenter surrounded by his children. He seemed asleep at peace. That same night Joseph died. His body was buried in a plot that the young man's father had acquired for him. The day of the burial, Jesus walked in silence, without words. Barely a tear crossed his face. From that moment on he became a man. Days later the young man visited Jesus in the workshop. He was sanding a chair delicately. He smiled upon seeing him, but soon his expression changed. He asked him a favor. He had to leave. He was going to join an austere community where he would strengthen his body and spirit. Meanwhile, he needed him to take care of his mother and his brothers. The response was affirmative. The commitment was sealed with a promise. Jesus spoke of his desire to teach, but not from power. He wanted to bring the word to those who had never had access to it, to denounce injustices, to heal wounds. His eyes sparkled. The other listened to him with attention. He promised to take care of his family and remain firm. Jesus departed towards the community of the Essenes, next to the Dead Sea. It was a group known for their humility, their love for their neighbor, and their peaceful resistance. There he began a new stage. After Jesus' departure, more than a year passed without news, until a merchant, a friend of the family from Kerioth, brought a letter addressed to the young man. It was from Jesus. In it, he recounted how his days were among the Essenes, dawns dedicated to meditation, tasks in the orchard, prolonged study of the scriptures, and wisdom teachings transmitted by the elders. He recounted with enthusiasm what he was learning, assuring that faith and love made the unthinkable possible. He asked about his mother, about his brothers, and made it clear that he did not doubt that his friend was fulfilling the promise to take care of them. He also inquired about the health of his friend's family, wishing that they would conserve the strength he remembered of them. In his words there was nostalgia and hope. Jesus asked him not to stray from the path, to remain firm in justice, in love for his neighbor, and in rectitude. He said that when the time came he would need him by his side, and he did not want to feel ashamed to call him brother. From then on, the letters began to arrive regularly, every few moons. They were brief but intense, and little by little, the one who received them began to anticipate the return of Jesus, knowing that together they would undertake something greater. Meanwhile, he decided to follow his father's trade. Simon Iscariot felt proud of that choice. They began to travel together through various regions of Judea and Galilee. Although they passed near the Dead Sea, they never tried to approach the community where Jesus was. The trips formed the young man. He learned to negotiate, to deal with all kinds of people, and to handle money with precision. The family prospered. On one of those journeys he met Rahamim, a young friend of Ruth and Rachel, Jesus' sisters. She was a Nazarene, which represented a difficulty before the young man's father, who had conservative positions. But Rahamim's sweetness and character eventually won the approval of both parents. Soon they married and formed a home near that of Simon and Siberea. They had 3 children in 5 years. Time passed without surprises. The days were filled with travels, agreements and family tasks. But in the country, things did not go the same way. The pressure of Roman power, added to the tributes imposed by local authorities, oppressed the people. Tradition weakened, customs mixed with foreign practices, and officials fell into corruption. Every time he visited his father, old Simon would repeat with sorrow, "How we need David." But the name of the ancient king was taboo, and any descendant of his lineage was forbidden to bear a sword. The young man would silence him with caution, fearing that someone might hear him. Meanwhile, in Rome, Augustus had been succeeded by Tiberius. Nothing changed for the territories under imperial dominion. After the death of Herod the Great, his sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, fought for control of the country. The emperor resolved the dispute by dividing it among them as if it were a personal inheritance. Archelaus governed Judea, Idumea, and Samaria, Antipas, Galilee and Perea, Philip, the northern regions near Damascus. Tensions did not take long to erupt. In Judea, uprisings arose driven by patriots such as the Zealots, Atronges, and another Simon. Although Archelaus crushed the rebellions with brutality, the ashes of discontent remained burning. The desire to free themselves from the Roman yoke did not disappear. The young man from Kerioth shared that longing for freedom, although he never joined the rebels. He was not oblivious to the suffering of his people, nor to the servitude imposed by those who wielded power. It was during those difficult years that his parents died. The mourning made him think about Jesus more frequently. He remembered clearly the pain that Jesus had suffered upon losing Joseph, and he understood better what that loss had meant. The day of his mother's burial, as he returned with his family from the cemetery, he stopped for a moment without saying a word and fixed his gaze on the distant silhouette of Mount Tabor. He remembered that other day, years ago, when he had done the same next to Jesus after burying Joseph. His thoughts flew to the region of the Dead Sea, imagining what his friend might be doing at that moment. He could not form an idea. It had been a long time since letters had arrived. The silence began to worry him, even more so upon knowing that the Essenes had been the object of severe repressions. Then, one ordinary afternoon, while he rested at home after returning from a trip, someone knocked on the door. Although he was nearby, Rahamim attended. When she opened, the light of dusk framed the figure of a young man, with a beard and white tunic. With a familiar and soft voice, that visitor greeted and asked if there was a little water in that house for a thirsty man. Upon looking into his eyes, his host recognized him immediately. They were those same eyes in which joy and sadness always mixed, and unable to help it, he called him by his name. "Jesus!" he exclaimed before hugging him tightly. The return marked a new beginning. After so many years, Jesus' presence brought with it the certainty that the time of waiting had ended. His journey through the Essene community had transformed him, and now he seemed ready to initiate what he had anticipated for so long. His friend, as he had promised, was there to support him. From promise to act. After his return, Jesus settled for a time in the region. His presence did not go unnoticed. Over the years, his appearance had changed. He looked more mature, with an expression of serenity that combined strength and compassion. His words now had a different cadence, as if each phrase were carefully measured, as if he already knew the impact it would have on those who listened to him. He gathered his closest friends, among them his former childhood companion, and began to share what he had been cultivating in silence for years. His ideas about the law were different, not because they contradicted it, but because they illuminated it from an unknown angle. He spoke of justice, but also of mercy. He spoke of firmness, but also of forgiveness. Many were moved by his vision. Others looked at him with suspicion. He was not a doctor of the law, nor a priest, nor a scribe, but he spoke with authority. His formation among the Essenes had left a mark on his thinking, but his essence went beyond any school. He had the determination of someone who had found his mission, and that was evident to all. The house of his mother became a meeting point. There, day after day, those who wanted to listen to him gathered. He spoke to them about the kingdom, but not one with borders or armies, rather one where love and justice reigned without impositions. He said that it was possible to live in another way, and that path had to begin within each person. Jesus did not seek followers, but many began to follow him. At first, they were only acquaintances, former neighbors, the curious. Soon they were also fishermen, merchants, even tax collectors. People of all kinds approached, attracted by the quiet strength of his words. His lifelong friend, the same one who had taken care of his family in his absence, watched with attention the growth of that movement. He did not feel displaced, but he did feel bewildered at times. He had been a witness to his childhood, his silences, his games, his doubts. Now he saw him become a public figure, someone who gathered multitudes. One morning, while they shared bread and olives, Jesus spoke to him directly. He told him that the time of preparation had ended, and that it was time to act. He needed each one of his friends to carry out the task. To him, he asked that he accompany him closely, that he be his shadow on the paths, not as a servant, but as someone who understood from the beginning what was to come. He accepted without hesitation. He had promised it years ago and was willing to fulfill it. He followed him with loyalty, helping to organize the tours, the resources, the routes. He also listened to him with attention, trying to understand the deepest layers of his teachings. The first trips were within Galilee. They went from village to village, entering synagogues, conversing with people in the markets, healing the sick, touching those who were avoided. Jesus had no fear of contact. Where others retreated, he advanced. He approached the lepers, spoke with marginalized women, listened to those whom society considered lost. Not everyone approved. Some Pharisees questioned him, the Sadducees watched him, and the scribes took note. But the common people followed him. He spoke in parables, using simple images: a sower, a lamp, a shepherd, and his sheep. Through those stories he revealed complex truths, which each listener interpreted according to their heart. On one of those days they crossed to the region of the Jordan. There multitudes came to see him. His presence caused commotion. Some wanted to be healed, others to listen. Some sought answers, others only hope. Amid that sea of faces, Jesus did not lose his calm. He always found time to look at each one as if they were the only one. One afternoon, amid a multitude exhausted by the heat, he stopped to speak in the shade of some olive trees. He spoke of the meek, of those who mourn, of the persecuted. He affirmed that in them was the true blessing. No one had spoken like that before. He did not promise power or riches, but consolation, justice, meaning. Those words touched fibers that are not forgotten. His childhood companion looked at him with admiration, but also with concern. He knew that a discourse like that, directed at the humble and the suffering, would end up unsettling the powerful. During their travels they shared everything: They slept under borrowed roofs, ate what was offered to them, and sometimes went hungry. Jesus did not complain. If he found a dry corner to rest, he considered himself fortunate. As the group grew, they began to organize. Jesus selected 12 among his most constant followers. To each one he gave a specific mission. To his old friend he entrusted one of the most delicate tasks, maintaining the order of resources. Someone had to administer what they received, register donations, make purchases. It was not a minor task. He accepted with responsibility. He knew about numbers, transactions, management. He had the practical mind for those matters. He became responsible for the group's money, a function that required trust. Over time, the travels extended beyond Galilee. They visited rural areas and important cities. Wherever they went, the reaction was the same. Some followed him with fervor, others observed him with suspicion. On one of those trips, a group of Pharisees waited to question him. They presented him with dilemmas about the law, hoping to make him fall into contradiction. Jesus responded calmly, using the scriptures, but with an interpretation that placed compassion first. That did not please them. From that day on, some began to plan how to discredit him. Jesus' fame grew. Accounts of healings and miracles spread rapidly. Some said he had resurrected a girl, others that he had multiplied food. Rumors mixed with real testimonies. No one knew for sure what was true, but everyone talked about him. On a certain occasion they entered a city and were received by a generous family. There Jesus rested for a few days. Meanwhile, his friend took the opportunity to reorganize the accounts. He gathered the records, reviewed the donations, made purchases. He knew that logistics was also a form of service. One night, while sharing dinner, Jesus spoke with sadness. He said that the path would not be easy, that there would be betrayals and losses. He did not say it with fear, but with certainty. Everyone listened to him in silence. Some lowered their gaze, others tried to distract the moment with a comment. But his gaze remained fixed. His friend, the same one who had been there from the beginning, felt a chill, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. It was as if Jesus already knew the outcome. Days later they set out again, this time towards Jerusalem. The atmosphere was charged. The religious authorities viewed him with suspicion. The rumors about his identity became bolder. Some called him a prophet. Others believed he was the awaited one. Jesus did not fuel those versions. He limited himself to teaching, healing, consoling. But each gesture, each word, seemed to confirm the suspicions of his opponents. During the journey to the holy city, they stopped in villages where they were well received. People came out to meet them, laid their cloaks before them, offered them food. In those moments his companion remembered the days when they both played among wood and sawdust, and now one of them was seen as sent. There was no arrogance in Jesus. He remained the same in his treatment, simple, close, human. But there was something in his presence that commanded respect, not out of fear, but because of the silent strength that emanated from his character. Shortly before reaching Jerusalem, they stopped on a hill. From there they could see the walls. Jesus observed in silence. No one said anything. They knew that entering that city would change the course of everything. That night, Jesus spoke with his friend. He reminded him of past promises, decisions made, and asked him to remain firm. There were no reproaches, only clarity. He nodded, convinced that he would do what was necessary, and together once more they resumed the path. The entry into Jerusalem was anything but discreet. Upon arriving, the multitude that had accompanied them spread their cloaks on the ground, while others waved palm branches. Jesus advanced without saying a word, mounted on a donkey. Some greeted him as a king, others as a savior. The religious leaders observed from afar, increasingly uncomfortable with his influence. Within the city the tensions were palpable. Every movement of Jesus was watched. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes saw him as a threat. He was not one of them, but the people listened to him with more attention than to the doctors of the temple. During the following days they visited the temple several times. Jesus showed himself indignant at the presence of merchants within the sacred precinct. In an act that surprised many, he overturned the tables, expelled the vendors, and denounced the profanation of the place. That gesture placed him at the center of all gazes. His act was seen by some as a necessary purification, but for others it was a direct provocation. His lifelong companion, who continued to take care of the group's practical matters, noticed how things were accelerating. The atmosphere became increasingly hostile. The secret meetings among the leaders of the Sanhedrin intensified. It was evident that they were seeking a way to stop him, but they needed to do so without provoking a revolt among the people. Jesus continued teaching in squares and courtyards, speaking of justice, of love for one's neighbor, of humility and truth. He said that the kingdom was not of this world, and that those who wanted to be great had to serve. His message challenged the established structures, not through violence but through contrast. One night, during a dinner among the 12, Jesus shared bread and wine with a solemn gesture. He told them to remember that moment, that what they shared was not just food, but a symbol of a covenant. Everyone listened to him with respect, although without fully understanding. After dinner, they withdrew to a nearby garden on the outskirts of the city. There, while the others rested, Jesus went apart to pray. He was troubled. Although he had always shown himself to be firm, that night he seemed to struggle internally. He knew what was coming, but he moved forward. In another part of the city, meanwhile, the leaders of the temple were closing deals. They needed to know where and when they could capture him without alarming the multitude. They sought an intermediary who knew his movements. Judas Iscariot, the one who knew him better than anyone, the one who had walked with him since childhood, who had shared games and travels, who had administered the group's resources, was the one who accepted to be the bridge. Not out of hatred nor ambition, but out of a personal conviction difficult to explain. Perhaps he sought to force a resolution, or perhaps he believed he was fulfilling a necessary role. No one would know for sure. The deal was simple: indicate the place and time when Jesus would be alone. In exchange, he received some coins. He asked for no more. Then he withdrew, his face somber. That same night, while the garden slept, a patrol with torches appeared. They were guided by the one who had lived with the Master for years. Upon arriving, he greeted Jesus with an affectionate gesture and thus identified him. Jesus did not resist. The others tried to intervene, but he asked for calm. Judas Iscariot, the absence after the cross. After the delivery of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the temple guards arrested him and took him before the high priest. During that night, he was interrogated without the presence of impartial witnesses. The religious authorities sought a formal reason to justify the execution. They presented witnesses whose version did not coincide. Finally, he was accused of blasphemy, based on his own statements about his relationship with God. At dawn, Jesus was taken before the Sanhedrin Council. The decision had already been made. The religious tribunal did not have the authority to execute a death sentence, so he was transferred to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in Judea. There the charges changed. He was accused of sedition, of proclaiming himself king, and of inciting the people against Rome. Pilate, after interrogating him, found no reason to condemn him. Upon learning that Jesus was a Galilean, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem for the festivities. Herod interrogated him without obtaining a response. He returned him to Pilate without issuing a judgment. Pressured by the crowd, Pilate offered to release a prisoner, as was customary at Passover. The choice was put between Jesus and a prisoner named Barabbas, accused of robbery and murder. The crowd asked for the release of Barabbas. Pilate, fearing riots, authorized the crucifixion of Jesus, although he publicly washed his hands of the decision. Jesus was scourged and forced to carry part of the instrument of his execution. On the way to the place known as Golgotha, a man from the town, Simon of Cyrene, was forced to carry the cross in his place. Around him, women wept. Jesus addressed brief words to them without diverting his steps. Upon arriving at the site, he was crucified between two condemned men. The authorities placed a sign with the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in several languages. Some witnesses recognized the soldiers dividing his garments by lot. During the hours he remained on the cross, various groups approached to observe. Some insulted him, others watched in silence. Some followers remained at a distance. Towards the end, Jesus uttered brief phrases, then he expired. A Roman centurion, witness to what had happened, recognized that the death was different from that of other prisoners. Seeing that the body was already lifeless, the soldiers did not break his legs, as was customary, but one of them pierced his side with a spear. The execution had concluded. That same day, Joseph of Arimathea requested the body to bury it. It was placed in a nearby tomb, belonging to his family, and sealed with a stone. Some women observed where he was laid. The next day the authorities sealed the entrance and placed guards, fearing that his followers would attempt to hide the body. The disciples dispersed. There was no organized resistance, only confusion, fear, and silence. After the burial, Jesus' followers remained hidden. None of them returned publicly to the temple. Some dispersed throughout the region, others remained in private homes. They feared being arrested for association. There were no manifestations or organized protests. The movement that had gathered multitudes was reduced to small groups without clear direction. On the third day after the execution, versions began to circulate among the followers. Some women declared that the tomb was empty. Others affirmed having seen him alive. Those testimonies spread among the disciples, provoking internal debate. There was no unified interpretation. Some believed, others doubted. The figure of Jesus began to reappear in private conversations, no longer as an arrested teacher, but as an active presence. The authorities, upon learning of the rumors, affirmed that the body had been stolen. They denied any irregularity in the process. The seal of the sepulchre was considered violated, but no investigations were initiated. The matter was officially closed. The main concern was to avoid disturbances in Jerusalem during the festivities. In the following days, the disciples began to meet again in private homes. Several of them assured having seen him alive. The meetings were discreet. They discussed the future of the group and the meaning of what had happened. From there, the first community centered on his teachings began to form. The memory of the crucifixion became a point of reference for the followers. It was interpreted as the fulfillment of a mission. The elements of the trial and execution were integrated into their subsequent accounts. The facts that had previously generated fear began to be narrated as an essential part of the message. Judas was not present at those meetings. None of the later texts mention him among those who witnessed the following days. He did not participate in the reorganization of the group, nor in the dissemination of the message. His figure was left out of everything that developed from then on. The remaining disciples chose a replacement to occupy his place. The process was formal, and the new member was incorporated without further reference to Judas beyond what was necessary to justify the election. From that moment on, the group was once again recognized as 12. Over time, the crucifixion went from being a public execution to becoming the central axis of the new message. It was interpreted as a sacrifice. Its memory was preserved in prayers, accounts, and symbols. But the process was not immediate. The first weeks after Jesus' death were marked by uncertainty. Only over time did structured narratives emerge, and only then did the interpretation of the facts as the fulfillment of the announced promises begin to spread. The records agree that after the crucifixion there was institutional silence. The authorities did not systematically pursue the disciples at that time. Jesus' case was treated as concluded. For Rome and for the religious leadership, the conflict had ended. What came next, the expansion of the message, was a later development. In the days immediately following his death, there were no signs that that movement would survive. It was the memory of his words, together with the testimonies about the empty tomb, that allowed the group to find a new purpose. The fate of Judas after the crucifixion. After the crucifixion of Jesus, Judas Iscariot was no longer seen among the group of disciples. There are no reliable records of his whereabouts in the following days. What happened to him after Jesus' arrest was transmitted through incomplete versions, many of them contradictory. Most testimonies agree that he tried to return the money he had received for delivering Jesus. According to the oldest texts, he threw the coins inside the temple, declaring that he had made a grave mistake. The priests did not accept the return. They considered the money unfit for the temple treasury for having been obtained in exchange for blood. With those coins, they bought a field later used to bury foreigners and unidentified persons. That land was called the Field of Blood. From that moment on, Judas disappeared. He did not return to the other disciples. No later text includes him in meetings, testimonies, or encounters that followed Jesus' death, nor are there indications that he attempted to reintegrate or explain his reasons. There are two main versions of his death. One affirms that he hanged himself. Another says that he suffered a fall in a field and his body was torn upon impact. Both agree that his death occurred shortly after the crucifixion, in solitude, outside the circle that had accompanied Jesus. His end, whatever it was interpreted as a direct consequence of his act. The first believers saw his death as an inevitable punishment. The betrayal of Jesus was considered irreversible, and Judas came to be identified solely by that fact. From then on, his name was excluded from the foundational account of the group. No details were preserved about his life before the last days. His previous contributions were not mentioned. Everything was reduced to the moment when he delivered Jesus and his death shortly afterward. In the accounts that circulated among the first Christian communities, Judas was presented as a symbol of internal betrayal. He was no longer a follower who had made a mistake, but the representation of one who breaks trust from within. This interpretation marked his figure definitively. The group of disciples formally replaced him. The vacancy was filled by Matthias, chosen by Lot, in an act intended to restore the symbolic number of 12. From that moment on, Judas was no longer mentioned among those close to Jesus. No subsequent attempt was recorded to rehabilitate his image within the original group, nor did voices emerge that sought to consider his story from other perspectives. His fate was that of isolation and oblivion. At the social level, his name became undesirable. It ceased to be used as a personal name in Christian communities. His mention became associated with betrayal and rejection. In some contexts, it was even used to curse or as a synonym for an internal enemy. During the following years, his figure was repeated in sermons, writings, and accounts as a warning. He became a negative example that was used to reinforce the need for loyalty and vigilance. In no official tradition was he included as a martyr, witness, or figure to be studied with nuances. After his death, the figure of Judas Iscariot was incorporated as a functional element within the moral and theological development of early Christianity. From the first writings, his story began to consolidate as a concrete warning about the risks of internal disloyalty, particularly within closed or spiritual communities. His role ceased to be that of just another disciple and became that of the model of the traitor. The official narrative avoided focusing on his complete history, his previous life, his close relationship with Jesus, or his practical contributions to the group were set aside. Everything was reduced to a single action, the delivery of his master. That act, isolated from its context, became an absolute symbol. In doctrinal formation later on, his role also served to transfer the weight of Jesus' arrest away from an exclusively institutional responsibility. Judas was functional in explaining what had happened without directly blaming the religious leaders or Rome. His betrayal became necessary to sustain the account. Over time, written and visual representations depicted him with a standardized image, harsh features, a somber expression, and often accompanied by the 30 coins. He was linked to punishment, despair, and even divine rejection. No majoritarian current within Christianity developed interpretations that nuanced his conduct or proposed a revision of his role from a more human or psychological perspective. His suicide, when mentioned, was interpreted as the inevitable result of his guilt. It was never treated as an expression of redeeming remorse, but as final proof of his fall. Thus, there was no room for forgiveness, nor was the possibility of personal redemption considered. Unlike other biblical characters who committed serious errors but were rehabilitated, Judas was excluded from that category. For centuries, his name was erased from personal records and removed from lists of acceptable names among believers. It became a synonym for betrayal in various languages. His figure was absorbed by Western culture and used as an archetype of the internal traitor in literature, theatre, painting, and moral teaching. Judas was not humanized. His image was not reconstructed from his complete history, but solely from his functional role in the events leading to Jesus' death. The emotional complexity or possible internal conflicts he may have experienced were never explored in depth in traditional accounts. To this day, his name remains associated with absolute betrayal. It is rare to find broad or critical analyses of his role beyond the stigma left by his final decision. His story, as adopted by tradition, continues to represent the example of one who betrays from within and remains outside any possibility of reconciliation.